everyone. So the purpose of this video is to go over the solution for homework 4, but I wanted to start off with a reminder of some of our recent developments from the class. So we recently added a couple of new lexical categories to our grammar. The first of these was T, and this includes things like can, could, may, might, will, would, shall, should, must, and present and past, which are silent morphemes, and this category might include other things too. Now the place that these lexical items come in is in our TP rule, which says that TP branches down into T and VP, and TPs occur in the S rule as the sister to NP. We also recently added the category C to our grammar for complementizer, and so far I believe the only thing that we have in this category is that, as in I believe that pigs can fly. And this comes in our CP rule, where the complementizer takes a complement that's a full sentence. Another thing that started to play an important role in our grammar is the idea of subcategorization. And this is the idea that lexical items can stipulate preferences about their complement. They can stipulate the syntactic category of their complement, and they can also stipulate that their complement be headed by a particular lexical item. So a couple of weeks ago we were talking about the verb rely, which has to have a prepositional phrase complement. This is shown by the possibility for a sentence like, the president relies on Congress, and the impossibility of a sentence like, the president relies. So there has to be a prepositional phrase complement. We also said something more specific about the kind of prepositional phrase that has to follow the verb rely. It has to be a prepositional phrase headed by the preposition on. So it's ungrammatical to say the president relies for Congress, for instance. That's bad. And we can't say the president relies about Congress, to Congress. No other preposition will work here. And the way we encoded this into our lexical entry for rely was by just using a little subscript on the prepositional phrase complement here. So this means that rely accepts a prepositional phrase complement as long as that prepositional phrase is headed by the preposition on. We also used subcategorization last week extensively to deal with certain facts about what kinds of verbs can follow our new category T. So all of these T categories, can, could, may, might, must, shall, should, and will, we noticed that these had to be followed by the bare form of any verb. For example, if we're talking about pigs being able to fly, we can say pigs can fly, but this can't be pigs can flies, pigs can flew, pigs can flying, pigs can flown. These are all bad. It has to be the base form of the verb that follows a T that's one of these, which are sometimes called modals. And the way that we captured this with subcategorization is that we imagined the lexical entries of all of these T heads indicating that they select for a verb phrase that's headed by a bare form verb. So all of these T heads have the same subcategorization. Now you'll remember that there are a couple of other T heads too, present and past, and those are still T heads, so they're still part of this list, but their subcategories are slightly different. So in the sentence pigs fly, there's a silent present tense morpheme here, and in pigs flew, there's a silent past morpheme there. And the lexical entries for these T heads stipulate that they have to be followed by a verb phrase with a present form verb and a past form verb, respectively. This idea that a head can subcategorize for the head of its complement is called head-to-head selection, and it's the way that we are representing head-to-head dependencies in our grammar, where there's some kind of relationship between two different lexical items. Can requires a verb in the bare form, and past tense requires a verb in past form. This will be really important for the homework 4 solution. Okay, so let's move on to the homework 4 solution. Let's start by looking at some similarities between sentences with the complementizer that in it and the new elements for and to. So looking at this sentence, we see a pronoun, a verb. This is our complementizer. Here's a name. This is one of our new T heads, and then another verb. We can analyze the sentence with some of our new rules. So starting with an S node, we have a noun phrase that has a pronoun inside of it. Using our S rule that says a sentence is made up of a noun phrase and a TP, we know there's going to be a TP here. This is new, which is past tense, right? It's new, not no. So there's a past tense morpheme here, it's silent. There's a verb phrase here, headed by the verb know. And the verb know subcategorizes for a CP, and specifically one headed by the complementizer that. So there's a CP here, complementizer that, make a little more room here, and now we have a new S. And then this T is the modal element could. And here we have a intransitive verb that doesn't select for anything. So let's compare this to sentences similar to some of the ones on the homework. Similar to the first one here, but with the verb arrange. I arranged for John to visit. One of your tasks for the homework was to decide what these two elements are, for and to. Now I'm writing the sentence right below the first one because one straightforward way of analyzing for and to in this sentence is exactly how we've analyzed that and could in the sentence above. So that is, we can think of for as a certain kind of complementizer and to as a T head. This might seem a little weird because both of these elements are homophonous with prepositions. That is, they have the same pronunciation as prepositions. But these look a little bit different than prepositions because, well, for to, it's got a verb following it. And most prepositions we've seen only allow noun phrases to follow them. As in, I gave a pizza to the cat. Don't ever do this. So here, to is a preposition, and it's pretty clear that the stuff that follows it is a noun phrase. So to really doesn't look like it's behaving like a preposition here. For, you might think, is behaving more like a preposition. There is a noun phrase that's coming directly after it. So John is a noun phrase. Now if this stuff right here really were a prepositional phrase, we'd probably want to think of a verb like arrange as having two complements, a prepositional phrase, and maybe we could call this a TP. This would require modifying our VP rule, which currently has an optional adverbial element at the beginning, and NP, AP, CP, and PP. If we wanted to say that arrange has two complements here, a prepositional phrase and a TP, we'd have to add TP to our verb phrase rule. That would mean that the structure of to would look like this. Assuming that this is the same TP rule that we already had, where a TP consists of a T and a VP. So if we added TP here, then the sentence to, I arranged for John to visit, would have this kind of structure. So what this predicts is that this PP and this TP do not form a constituent. They are not a natural grouping to the exclusion of anything else in the sentence, like arranged. Let me show you why that doesn't seem to be right. That is why this PP and this TP do seem to form a constituent, which would mean that our syntax needs to reflect that in some way. This reason has to do with our coordination schema. which says that you can coordinate a phrase of any kind as long as it's made up of two other phrases joined together with a coordinator, and as long as those two other phrases have the same syntactic category as the overall coordinate structure. So what I'm going to do here is use the coordination schema as sort of a diagnostic for determining whether some set of things form a constituent together. This assumes that the coordination schema gets the right structures for coordinate structures in our language, but I believe that's true. So I want you to consider 3, which is similar to example 12 on homework 4, and similar to example 2, except that it has a coordinate structure in it. I arranged for John to visit and for Stu to cook. So what this shows us is that it's possible to coordinate all this material for John to visit with another string with the same exact kind of things in it. Since the coordination schema requires that a coordination structure be made up of two parts with the same syntactic category, this stuff that I've underlined here should all fall under a single node in the syntax tree. And we saw that if we don't think of it in that way, we think of this as a prepositional phrase and a TP, there's no way that our coordination schema will let us coordinate these things here because they don't fall under a single node to the exclusion of any other material. So in order for this material to be coordinatable, what we want is a structure where all of this stuff for John to visit falls under a single node. Now I suggested up here that 4 is a complementizer and 2 is a T, and that would allow us to think of all this stuff as a CP, a complementizer phrase. Again, this syntactic analysis would allow for John to visit to all be a constituent. This would allow us to coordinate that stuff. So we would have a CP coordinated with another CP. So let's adopt this analysis because it allows us to capture that fact. So again, we're now thinking of the morpheme 4 as a complementizer and the morpheme 2, in this case, as a T head. So in our theory, these two things are exactly parallel to the complementizer that and a modal like could. But there are still some important facts that we can't capture yet about these two different kinds of CPs. We can capture the fact that we can't say things like, I knew for John to visit. This is pretty easy for our grammar to capture in the form of a lexical entry. So verbs like know stipulate in their lexical entry that they can accept a CP complement as long as that CP is headed by that. And verbs like arrange stipulate in their lexical entry that they only accept a CP headed by 4. So we can capture that. But what we can't capture yet is the fact that we can't say things like I arranged for John could visit. We can't say could, can't say would, can't say should, can't say any other modal, may, might, will, etc. We also can't imagine there being a past morpheme here, which would require the verb to be visited. I arranged for John visited is pretty bad, and we can't imagine a present morpheme here either. I arranged for John visits, also bad. And similarly, if the complementizer is that, we can't use the T head to. I know that John to visit. That's pretty bad. It has to be either a modal, like could, would, will, and we can use a past and present T head also, where this would be I know that John visited, and this would be I know that John visits. These are all fine. So how can we explain this? This is a little bit tricky because we can't use the kind of subcategorization that we've been using. And that's because our rules put the C head for too far away from the T head, so it can't subcategorize for it. So even if we're thinking of the list of complementizers including that and for, the theory that we've built so far doesn't let us explain the dependency between 4 and 2. They're too far away from each other. So we can't just write a lexical entry for the complementizer 4 that says that it selects for a particular type of S. When we did this for verbs like rely, for example, we said that they select for a prepositional phrase headed by the preposition on. And this subscript that we put here is always the thing that's the head of the phrase that is selected for. So if we want to say that 4 somehow selects for an S with a 2 in it, this 2 would have to be the head of S, but it's the head of TP. So these are currently too far away from each other for us to encode this dependency in the subcategorization of the complementizer 4. So we have a couple of different options at this point. How are we going to capture the head-to-head dependency between 4 and 2? So the first thing we could consider doing is enriching the subcategorization system. So if we took this route, we might, for example, say that, well, before these elements were too far away from each other, we're going to develop a notation where a complementizer or any other lexical category can select for something that is not the head of its complement, but the head of some phrase inside of its complement. We should be suspicious of this because we're developing fancier technology, and we want our system to be as simple as possible. So this turns out to be one of the very few cases where we have this kind of longer distance subcategorization. Maybe this isn't a thing that we want to think of language as doing, maybe not something we want to encode into our theory. The second option is to change our rules somehow. What I mean by this is maybe when we wrote this S rule, we got something a little bit wrong. Maybe the thing that is the complement of the complementizer is actually TP or something that has this 2 as its head. And what we're going to go with here is the second option. So we are actually going to change our rules. We're going to now think of a sentence as not being something that has this S label, but as a TP. So previously, our rules look like this. An S is made up of an NP and a TP. TP is made up of T and VP. And what we want is a structure in which the complementizer 4 is close enough to the T head 2 that it can subcategorize for it. So our lexical entry for 4 is going to look like this. So 4 subcategorizes for a TP whose head is 2. So let me put a TP here. So following our current rule, the head of TP is T and its complement is VP. Now this has an obvious problem with it of not allowing any room for the subject because we no longer have an S here, and it's our S rule that allows the subject to enter a sentence. So here's how we're going to change the rules. A CP still contains a C, but now the complement of C is TP, and I'm getting rid of our S rule. And our TP rule is going to serve the function of both of the old S and TP rules. So TP is going to introduce the subject. So let me redraw this tree here. So now we have an NP, now a T, and then our VP as the third branch. Okay, so we've solved the problem of the head-to-head dependency between 4 and 2. 2 is the head of TP, and TP has replaced our S rule. Now that 2 is the head of the complement of 4, 4 can subcategorize for particular kinds of TPs. But there's still a problem with this analysis, and that's shown to us by some of the data in dataset A. I'm going to switch to the numbers from the homework here. Okay, so these examples show a few different coordinate structures. And the issue is that one of these examples reveals that the structure I just drew up here is not quite right. So 12 shows 2 CPs being coordinated, CPs headed by 4. And our analysis does make this possible. So it's this kind of unit that's coordinated in 12. In 13, what we have is 2 verb phrases that are coordinated. So here's one verb phrase, take the luggage to the hotel. And then here's the other one, meet me at the airport. We didn't do any changes to the verb phrase in our new rules, so this is still accounted for. So we can still coordinate this kind of thing. But example 13 shows two things being coordinated that start with our new T head, to meet me at the airport and to take the luggage to the hotel. We might want to say that there are two TPs being coordinated here, but with the analysis that we just developed, T and the following VP do not form a constituent that can be coordinated. If we coordinated this TP, we'd also have to include a subject in the second conjunct. And example 13 doesn't include another thing like Hilda. So there's this sort of annoying puzzle here. With our old rules, we would have been able to explain this. With our old rules, the T head 2 forms a constituent with all the stuff that follows it. And that's because we had the subject introduced by the S rule and not by the TP rule. And so it'd be easy to coordinate that stuff because all the TP included was the T head and the verb phrase. With our new rules, though, we can't explain why 2 and the VP that follows it is something that can be coordinated. And this is because our new rules don't say that T and VP are a constituent that excludes the subject. But we made this decision for a principled reason, and it was because we wanted to explain the dependency between 4 and 2. We wanted 4 to be able to select for 2 in some way. So we got rid of this S layer to move the TP up so that 4 could select for it. So instead of moving back to our old rules and maybe finding some other way to explain the head-to-head dependency here, I'm going to be hell-bent on keeping our new rules. So we're never going to see this again. So I want to find an approach that has the benefit of both the old rules and the new rules. That is, I want to find a way for T and VP to be a constituent, and I want to make sure that I can still capture the dependency between 4 and 2. So here's what I'm going to suggest. I'm going to suggest that we think of 4 as still selecting for a TP, and that TP still has a noun phrase at its left. This is the subject. But instead of having 3 branches here, I'm just going to have 2 branches. And I'm going to put a constituent here that includes both 2 and the verb phrase. Because we're still calling 2 a T, I'm also going to label this next node TP, but I'm going to temporarily write it in blue chalk, just to show that it's a little bit different from the TP up here. So let's take a second to appreciate what this structure gets us. First, it allows us to capture the dependency between 4 and 2. I'm asserting. So this T head is not just the head of this TP, but also this one. Somehow these are sort of the same TPs here. And it also lets us capture the constituency of 2 and the following verb phrase that we saw in example 13. Okay. So we've checked off both of these criteria here. So we had to figure out a way to write this in our rules. So CP is still a phrase that has a complementizer and a TP in it. And what we're going to do for TP is sort of break it down into 2 different rules. So the main TP is going to be made up of a noun phrase, subject, and the constituent that I labeled in blue here. But we don't want to have to keep using different colors, so I'm going to use a special notation here. I'm going to say that this constituent is called a T with a bar on top of it. And I'm just going to refer to this thing as T bar. Now there's going to be a T bar rule that says T bar is made up of T and VP. This bar over the letter is sort of typographically difficult. It's not easy to put a bar over a character in Microsoft Word, for example, so I'm going to actually give myself an easier way to do this with a little prime symbol or apostrophe. And I'm also going to change this in our tree to the T bar. So this looks like a really kind of crazy change to our grammar, but it's going to have really important consequences for the rest of the class. So we made a really big change here by getting rid of the S rule completely. So you might be wondering if this has any impact on how we represent the structures for simple sentences, like I drove the car. And it does. So we completely got rid of our S rule. We replaced it with TP. So the subject of the sentence is the pronoun, which is NP, and this is now introduced by our TP rule. And what this means for us is that we're now representing sentences as TPs, even simple ones like this. Our T head here is past, drove is past. And there we have it. So before I conclude by summarizing the changes that we made to the grammar here, I want to address a question that some of you might have had. So earlier we were thinking about differences between the verb know and the verb arrange, and the particular versions of these verbs where they select for a CP. And we said that a verb like know subcategorizes for a CP that has the complementizer that as its head, and that arrange subcategorizes for a CP with complementizer for as its head. And we also talked about the lexical entry for, specifically that it subcategorizes for a TP headed by 2. And we didn't talk about the lexical entry for the complementizer that. So it surely selects for a TP, but it's compatible with many more T heads than the complementizer for is. So it's totally okay to say, I know that pigs can fly. The T head here is the modal can, right? Just to practice, here's the tree for that. And there are a whole bunch of different kinds of T's that can work here. So we can say, I know that pigs could fly, maybe at some point in the past. I know that pigs might fly someday. I know that pigs will fly someday. I know that pigs should fly. Shall works here. Must, may. In the present and past, T heads also work. Pigs, I know that pigs flew, and I know that pigs present fly. So it almost looks like any kind of T head works here. So maybe we could just say that that is a complementizer that selects for just any kind of TP. But we added 2 to our list of T's, and it doesn't seem like 2 is a T that'll work with the complementizer that. I know that pigs to fly is not very good. So it'd be nice if we had some way that we could encode this into the lexical entry for that. It's a little bit tricky. We don't want to add a disjunction here, like a subscript that has this long list of T's in it, can, could, might, will, should, shall, etc. And we want to be consistent with stating positively what the complement is allowed to have. So we shouldn't say that that requires a TP as long as that TP is not headed by 2. So the way we're going to account for this in our grammar is by separating the list of T's into 2 different kinds of T's. There's one group that includes 2, and then there's another group that includes all the other ones we just looked at. Could, can, should, shall, may, might, must, will, present, and past. And I'm going to give these 2 categories of T's different labels. So when the T head 2 combines with a verb, it's often referred to as the infinitive form of a verb. And I'm going to take advantage of this name to make labels for these 2 different categories. So the in part of infinitive means roughly no, and the finite part of infinitive means roughly limit. And it has this name because there are no time boundaries placed on a TP with 2 as its head. We could be talking about the future, the past, it just doesn't really specify anything to do with it. And this other category does seem to specify those in some way. So present is not talking about an event in the past. Will is talking about some kind of event in the future. I think you get the idea. So to simplify things, I'm going to replace this no part of the meaning of infinitive with a minus, and I'm going to abbreviate finite as fin. So I'm going to call these 2 categories of T's minus fin, and the other category is plus fin. And so to explain how the complementizer that will accept anything from this category, to account for that in our grammar, we're going to say that it can select for TP as long as the head of that TP is plus fin. Okay, so let's sum up all the changes we made to the grammar. So we made some pretty significant changes to the rules. We no longer have an S rule, but we have a TP rule that introduces the subject into the sentence. We're now saying there's this constituent called T bar that's part of a TP, and T bar contains a T head and a VP. And in the CP rule, the C no longer has an S as its complement, but a TP as its complement. So these are the three big changes we made here. All the other rules are still the same, although they're going to be changing pretty soon. We still have our two schemas that we had before. The coordination schema we use as a diagnostic here for constituency, and the adjunction schema. We added 4 to the list of complementizers and 2 to the list of T's. So it's specifically non-finite T head, and plus finite includes present and past and the modals. And we talked a little bit about subcategorization frames for the new complementizer. It subcategorizes for a TP that's headed by 2, whereas that subcategorizes for a TP headed by any of the plus finite heads. The new T head 2 subcategorizes for a VP that's headed by a bear verb in the bear form. This is similar to the modal T heads like could, that also require a VP headed by a bear verb. But these are different from the present and past T heads. Present requires a verb phrase headed by a verb in the present form, and past requires a verb phrase headed by a verb in the past form. So this is confusing. I'd suggest looking at some of the sentences from homework 4 and practicing drawing trees with them. And as always, we're available by email for questions and always available in our office hours. So that's it, and I hope this was helpful.